Dennis Dalton, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Barnard College, Columbia University, taught and published about Mahatma Gandhi's thought and leadership for 45 years, beginning at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, where he received his PhD on Indian political theory in 1965, and then for 39 years at Barnard College. His publications include a study of Gandhi's theory and practice entitled Mahatma Gandhi, Nonviolent Power and Action, first published by Columbia University Press in 1993, and then in large editions appearing in 2000 and again this year. He has edited a collection of Gandhi's writings, Mahatma Gandhi's Selected Political Writings, published by Hackett in 1996. He has spent 3 years in India researching Gandhi's life and ideas, beginning in 1960. His focus has been on the originality of Gandhi's theories of freedom and power, and how Gandhi developed and applied these ideas to his leadership of the Indian independence movement from 1919 to 1947. And now at this point, I'd like to hand over the presentation to Dennis Dalton.
Thank you, Jake. And thanks, Jake, for all your assistance. I really appreciate it. Well, namaste, friends. I've titled this webinar talk, as Jake said, Gandhi's Journey and the Power of Nonviolence. So first to the initial theme of the journey. Gandhi himself characterized his life as a journey, or he liked to use the term pilgrimage to truth or to freedom. Now this, as you know, is an ancient concept, so it's not surprising that he would use it. Yet, since it's at the core of his message of life as a quest, we can speculate about what inspired him to see his life in this way. He could have derived it from the classical Hindu idea of the four ashramas, or the ideal stages in an individual's progression towards self-realization of ultimate knowledge. As you probably know or have heard, the Bhagavad Gita, Gandhi's sacred source, the Bible of Hinduism, says that the enlightened person is one who sees the self in all creatures and all creatures in the self. This surely is at the heart of Gandhi's view of truth and life. It's interesting, too, that among the 20 books that Gandhi cites in 1909 as authorities in the appendix to his first major treatise called Hind Swaraj, or Indian Independence, among these books are Plato's Defense of Socrates and Thoreau's Civil Disobedience. Both Socrates and Thoreau use the same metaphor of life as a pilgrimage or a journey to truth. So when Gandhi called his life a pilgrimage to truth or to freedom, he meant both liberation of his country and liberation of himself from the anger that he felt towards racial discrimination and injustice. He called his autobiography The Story of My Experiments with Truth. And it's such a compelling and dramatic story that film directors like Sir Richard Attenborough were drawn to it and captured it in Attenborough's film Gandhi that you've probably seen, was released in 1982. We'll try here in only 40 minutes, as against the film's 3 hours and 15 minutes, to portray Gandhi's journey from childhood to his most dramatic single moment, the culmination of the Salt March of 1930. And after that, we turned 20 minutes of questions or comments from you. I certainly look forward to that. And as Jake said, please do feel free to email me at the address that he provided, and it will be forwarded to me, and I will do my level best to answer your questions if I can't on this broadcast. But certainly thank you for being there. Now, the journey in pictures. The following selection of photos that I'll show from early to late in Gandhi's life, this selection is intended to show that if ever a person's life may be portrayed as a journey, then it was Gandhi's. The dramatic changes that occurred in his ideas were usually accompanied by differences in dress or facial expression, as illustrated in these photos. A youth shaped by Hinduism. Mohandas Gandhi, age 7, of course, on the left, at his birthplace of Porbandar, now in the state of Gujarat in western India, and then on the right, at age 17 in nearby Rajkot, where he graduated from Alfred High School in 1887. In terms of developmental psychology, if we wish to use it, biographers of Gandhi like Erik Erikson in Gandhi's Truth wrote of his successive identities or his perception of selfhood. To inform such analysis, we look to Gandhi's own autobiography, where he supplies plenty of information about how he formed his sense of self. So from this approach, we may call this early stage of life his primary identity, shaped by the circumstances of his Hindu family. So, to summarize briefly his childhood and adolescence, we can say they were shaped by three distinct forces. First, the region of his birth. This was a relatively small town, Porbandar, in western India, unlike the large cities of Bombay, Delhi, Calcutta, Madras, and this brought him close to the vast rural population of India. The significance of this is that Gandhi was unlike those who had become political leaders of India before he assumed power in 1919. They came from prominent urban areas, highly developed through British rule, but not where the vast numbers of India's population lived, of course, the peasants who inhabited the 700,000 villages of the vast rural regions. Gandhi eventually used this close connection to the peasantry to his advantage by mobilizing and politicizing regions that had been untouched by the independence movement before. He excelled at political organization especially of the peasantry, and he managed in a short time from 1919 to 1922 to turn the Indian National Congress, the main political organization in India. It was transformed for the first time into a mass movement with a rural base after 1919. This was among his most remarkable gifts, and it had not been achieved before by elites out of touch with the villages. Now to his class and caste status in terms of his childhood. He was born into a relatively low caste in the Hindu caste hierarchy of Hinduism and into a lower middle class family that again identified him nearer to the peasantry and not with the high caste Brahmins or the wealthy aristocracy. Gandhi had a genius for turning apparent weaknesses or disadvantages into strengths. Just as his region of birth connected him, as we saw, to the peasant population, so did his relatively low placement of caste. He was third down on the caste hierarchy, as well as his economic status. Again, unlike those Brahmins who had formed and led the Indian National Congress, which was first organized in 1885, unlike them, Gandhi played eventually to his advantage as he later became identified as a man of the people, not of the high caste elites. And finally, in the summary, to his childhood. The influence of his large family and its orthodox Hinduism, this was conveyed especially through his mother, with her example of vows, fasting, and self-control. This was an intense maternal role model of caring that she provided, with a primary emphasis on ahimsa meaning strict nonviolence. Above all, then, we can say that this primary identity was formed by Hinduism, brought forcefully to him through his extended family. He was the youngest of 4 children, but he had 2 much older siblings as well by his father's first marriage. He became his mother's darling, and she, a devout Hindu, was immensely influential in shaping his values, as he repeatedly proclaimed throughout his life. Political analysts of his method, like Suzanne Rudolph, who has written a superb biography of Gandhi. Rudolph has perceptively linked this maternal role in his life, this role model, to what is called his maternal style of politics. From the primary identity then to the emulative, the shift in stages, emulating British culture. During his loyalist period as a staunch admirer of the British Empire at age 21 as a law student in London, his aim, he says in his autobiography, was to become like an English gentleman. Gandhi attended a characteristically anglicized high school, Alfred High School, where the curriculum had been dictated by the British because they energetically employed education at every level to sustain their rule. So at Alfred High School, where he had studied British literature under English masters, he became attracted to the culture of England, gradually forming a strong desire to study law in London. The family pooled its resources to send him to England, believing that a British-trained lawyer would uplift their status. But it wasn't only money that drove Gandhi to pursue a career in law. He became a true Anglophile. And in his autobiography, he devotes a chapter to this arduous task of becoming an English gentleman with a proper set of manners, of tastes, and conduct, all with a passion to emulate the colonizer. Because, he asked, didn't their long and successful rule of India prove the superiority of Western civilization? And now, to the height of his emulative stage, the successful lawyer. At age 37, he was in a lucrative law practice as a barrister in Johannesburg, South Africa, in 1906. If the British used English education to enforce their empire in India, then their tradition of English law gradually built a professional elite of Indian lawyers to serve that system of colonialism. Here at the height of his emulative stage, Gandhi, now representing an Indian minority of immigrant merchants in South Africa, he was in South Africa for 21 years. He's not only at this time, in early 1906, making a lot of money, but also ardently practicing what he preaches. He believes in the sanctity of law as a necessary pillar to uphold the British Empire, whether in South Africa or India. He's a firm believer in the justice and fairness of the British court system and all the values that it served. Now, what a transformation of self that you should be seeing in this slide of Gandhi as a self-resistor in 1914. A civil resistor, I should say. Here's a change of dress and countenance that signaled a profound change of thought and action. Age 45, at the successful conclusion of his civil disobedience campaign in South Africa in 1914. Here's the life change that occurred in 10 years and less between ages 37 and 45. Here's the stage in the journey that certainly counts. Now, what caused such a dramatic shift of identities? We can see clearly from his photo that he's lost a lot of hair during this time. He's lost his fancy dress style of an English gentleman. But from his writings and his actions, we may also see just as clearly that he's lost a more crucial part of himself, his loyalty to the British Crown, his whole belief in the British system of justice. This change, in a phrase, from racial discrimination, and in a word, from apartheid. The question is not really what caused it. It was clearly racial discrimination, but why it took so long in coming. The explanation comes from his intense loyalty in his emulative phase to British law. He believed in it as a just and indispensable system of order. His commitment to all the trappings of Western civilization, that was all part of him, and they were released. And so with this time, this photo, we see him in what we call his radical, separatist, exclusivist self. He says at this time that India must not emulate the West, it will be ruined. And he rejects then Western civilization in its entirety. In the depths, though, of his disillusionment over the loss of faith in the British Empire that he experiences during this time. From this period comes his monumental discovery of a new method of resistance, a remedy for his crisis of conscience, and he called it Satyagraha, signaling an intense, in theory, practice, dress, countenance, an intense commitment to his religious roots. So the power of nonviolence, the second part of the presentation today, begins with an explanation of Satyagraha, which means literally adhering firmly to the forces of truth and love. This was a word coined by Gandhi. It did not exist before. It comes from the two roots, satya, which is truth, and agraha, adhering to, grasping firmly to. This became the core of his message and the meaning of his action. And he said that the power of love and compassion in Satyagraha is 1,000 times more effective than that of punishment or of any form of violence. Satyagraha is the core concept of Gandhi's whole system, the source of his reputation and role as a leader, whether as the brilliant political strategist of the civil disobedience marches in both South Africa and India, or as the moral exemplar of ethics in politics. It should be carefully understood, and we can understand it in part by reading Howard Gardner's excellent book, Creating Minds. He groups Gandhi with Freud, Einstein, Picasso, and a few other 20th century figures who were outstanding for their originality. Howard Gardner, in Creating Minds, writes of Gandhi that he was, quote, a thinker of the highest order. Satyagraha was an imaginative philosophical system with every step and its possible consequences carefully calibrated. Now, the essence of Satyagraha is a concept of power put into practice to transform a state and society. Satyagraha means not merely mass strikes, they've been around for a long time, which often lack any sign of compassion for the adversary. It means more than that, ridding oneself of anger and hatred so the force of nonviolence will flow. Martin Luther King later called this a purging of violence of the spirits. Both Gandhi and King sought liberation from fear to evoke another kind of force, that of love. And this did become the vital center of their method, the force of love. Gandhi insisted when facing down Indian and international terrorists that there was no meeting ground between them and him. Satyagraha, he repeatedly said, was a complete substitute for violence. And if perfected, it could work in all circumstances. The problem was not in the principle, he insisted, because nonviolent non-cooperation could stop even a tyranny, he believed. The difficult tasks that he summoned were to achieve the courage and commitment to inspire enough determination to mobilize an organization with the right strategy. To make Satyagraha effective within a mass movement was a formidable undertaking. Gandhi remains our historic model for achieving this. Now, as a national leader, age 49, local dress after his return from South Africa in 1914 to India, shortly before assuming leadership of the Indian national movement for independence in 1919. Gandhi is now poised for leadership of the nationalist movement, but one crucial event consolidated his resolve. This was the infamous Amritsar Massacre on April 13th of 1919 that's so well portrayed in Richard Attenborough's feature film. Following World War I, the British Raj passed draconian laws to suppress any resistance, violent or nonviolent. In the city of Amritsar, a large crowd of 10,000 Indians gathered on April 13, 1919, to celebrate a religious holiday. It was a combined holiday of both Hindus and Sikhs there. They celebrated, crowded into the town square in Amritsar, a park about the size of a football field called Jallianwala Bagh. Unlike a football field, though, it's surrounded by high walls and only one entrance, and you can see it today. It's a national memorial. General Reginald Dyer was appointed by the British, an unflappable general, they thought, because of his distinguished record in World War I. He's played in the film superbly by Edward Fox in Attenborough's feature. Dyer saw this gathering as a mob, acting in defiance of his martial law. He marched 50 of his crack rifles into the square, and he fired without warning into the crowd, killing 400 men, women, and children, and wounding 1,500. Later, he passed his appalling crawling order that Indians should get down on their bellies and wriggle like worms, I'm quoting now from the order itself, in repentance for the disorder that they, the Indians, had caused. Gandhi's response to this was really remarkable. It marked a crucial escalation of his power of nonviolence, rejecting the call of Indian terrorists who were well organized in India at this time, the terrorists calling for British blood in retaliation for the Amritsar Massacre. Gandhi instead proclaimed his famous maxim that an eye for an eye and the whole world goes blind. If we fight Dyer, he said, with violence, then we will become like Dyer, using the same inhumane methods. Instead, he said, we will use the power of forgiveness and actively non-cooperate with the violence of the Raj by employing Satyagraha. From this moment, the British lost any claim that they had to ruling with moral authority. By age 55, as you can see from this picture of the Gandhi that we know, Gandhi had so simplified his clothing that Churchill could call him a half-naked fakir. British cartoons depicted him thus, but Gandhi saw this as part of his philosophy of renunciation and knew that Indian tradition valued its symbolism. By 1925, then, Gandhi had achieved worldwide recognition because of his new political method of satyagraha, employed on a national scene from 1919 to 1922 in his first non-cooperation movement. His renown as both a moral leader and an effective political strategist brought him invective from the British Raj in public, but in private, as we can see from the private letters of the British rulers, there was deep ambivalence over dealing with Gandhi. We'll see this in a moment with the Salt March and the British reaction to it. Gandhi's change of dress, or rather lack of it, becomes one of the most potent symbols because it both identifies him with the simplicity and the poverty of the masses, as well as signifying his presence as a holy man in their midst. The British Raj responds to this in the 1920s, in the 30s, and again in the 40s, with intermittent periods of imprisonment of Gandhi. But their quandary is that every time they release him, he contrives another campaign of civil disobedience. Gandhi as a political strategist has been emphasized by a number of writers about Gandhi, most astutely probably by Gene Sharp in his excellent book From Dictatorship to Democracy that, as you may know, inspired much of the resistance in Serbia against Milosevic and also in Egypt and Tunisia. Gene Sharp is an analyst of Gandhi as a political strategist. Now, we can say that by far the most famous of his mass campaigns of civil disobedience is called the Salt Satyagraha, when in 1930 he unleashed the power of nonviolence through mass action against the infamous salt tax that the British had imposed on all Indians, heaviest on the poor peasantry, for whom a year's taxation on salt could comprise a week's wages. The reason for the fame, the historical significance of the Salt March lies in its perfect drama. Henry Thoreau, as you know, had practiced tax resistance in the 1840s, and before him there was the Boston Tea Party. But never had the world witnessed a show remotely like Gandhi's performance now. Gandhi began in February 1930 by carefully choosing his method and the 80 marchers who would accompany him on the Salt March. He knew in 1929, the year before, that the method would be mass civil disobedience, but the exact form that it was to take, a march to the sea taking 24 days and there collecting natural sea salt, this occurred to him only in mid-February, a month before the march began. It was entirely his idea. It showed him as a political strategist at his very best. Most of the other Congress leaders close to him missed it entirely. They openly derided Gandhi for proposing what they regarded as absurd, either because the British could easily arrest him and stop the action, or it would be ignored by most people as a senseless gesture. Now, in his attack on the salt tax, Gandhi seized on symbolic as well as economic injustices. Next to air and water, he said, salt is perhaps the greatest necessity of life. It is the only condiment of the poor. Through this injustice, the British exploit the starving millions, the sick, the maimed, the utterly helpless. The salt tax constitutes, he said, the most inhuman poll tax that the ingenuity of man can devise. The issue of raising the salt tax was by no means an obvious choice. The British collected most of their revenue from property taxes, and it seemed logical that this should be the target of the movement. But Gandhi understood well, as he says here, that the salt tax alone affected all the people, while only a minority held property. The British had imposed a monopoly on the use of salt, imposed that from the beginning of their rule. They insisted that only when they had collected, manufactured, and distributed salt could it be sold. One of the few Congress leaders who understood why Gandhi chose the salt tax perceived its symbolic meaning and remarked to Gandhi, I see that you don't want to collect salt, you want to manufacture civil disobedience. Now, the Salt March to the Sea in 1930 comprises a number of vital elements. First, the classic letter to Lord Irwin, March 2nd, 1930, 10 days before the march was to begin. In that letter, and then in a public announcement in the press, he published his plan of campaign of mass civil disobedience to walk 240 miles in 24 days with 80 of his ashram members from Ahmedabad to the coast of Western India. The purpose was to defy the British salt tax by gathering natural sea salt, and we'll look at the tension that builds on the eve of the march, on March 11th, as to whether the British will arrest Gandhi. These then were the main features of the campaign. First, Gandhi seizing the initiative, showing his fearless, open defiance by informing Lord Irwin, the Viceroy of India, of the exact particulars of the nonviolent campaign. One crucial aspect of Gandhian civil disobedience is that there should be no secrecy, only open explanation of what lies ahead, and that should extend to both adversary and followers alike. The marchers themselves were carefully selected by Gandhi from the ashram, where they had lived with him for at least a year before the campaign began. They had experienced the exacting discipline of ashram life. They were thoroughly committed to nonviolence as an article of faith. They were able to face death, they affirmed, and I had the privilege of interviewing a good many of them. They faced death without fear. Some of the 80 marchers were in their teens, which was why I was much later able to interview them. They're still alive. In 1960, set to 75, when I was in India working on Gandhi. The average age of the marchers was only 26, remarkable considering the fact that Gandhi was 60. And now the opponent, Gandhi's opponent, Lord Edward Irwin. His dates: he was Viceroy of India during the Salt Satyagraha, and he was, of course, Gandhi's chief adversary. He was the one who received the letter. We should pause to examine Gandhi's letter to Lord Irwin by noting who was involved in the exchange and its contents. Lord Irwin had been Viceroy of India for 4 years when he got Gandhi's letter. He was not new to the job or to the risks involved. Only 4 months earlier than this, his train had been bombed by Indian terrorists, and he narrowly escaped injury. When Gandhi mentioned in this letter that Irwin had a choice of dealing either with him or the terrorists, it struck a responsive chord. Finally, Irwin had a reputation in Britain as being a person of integrity, a pious Christian, trusted by the Prime Minister in London and by King George V. So he was well connected with the powers to be in London. He had more power than most viceroys. Yet, as it turned out, Gandhi stumped him. When he received Gandhi's letter, his only response was to warn Gandhi against the risk of breaking the law. Yet his ambivalence, Irwin's ambivalence, is what needs scrutiny, because this helped make the movement succeed. Gandhi argued very cogently that nonviolent action exacerbates ambivalence in a ruling authority, while violence resolves ambivalence, giving the ruler license to kill the resistors. An ambivalent authority, then, nourishes civil disobedience. This was one of Gandhi's key insights. Gandhi's ally in all of this has not been recognized as much as Lord Irwin, but he should be. He's Reginald Reynolds, an English Quaker who joined Gandhi's ashram and then hand-delivered to Lord Irwin Gandhi's letter with its plan of civil disobedience. Reginald Reynolds was only 25 years old when he joined Gandhi's ashram, but he was exactly the type needed to deliver this letter, an earnest, intelligent, trustworthy pacifist who, as an English Quaker, carried authenticity with him. Gandhi called him his heaven-sent messenger to carry the letter. Reynolds later wrote that the action demonstrated proudly the powerful symbolism of a Briton conveying his adherence to Gandhi's cause, speaking thus for humanity and justice, not merely for a single country. Here was a man of the West with the good sense to oppose his own British imperialism. Gandhi could not have found a better envoy. Now, the historic letter to Lord Irwin itself, which is such a classic that it deserves very close analysis, and I have, in the writings that Jake mentioned, given special attention to it. First, it informs Irwin, his adversary, of the proposed action 10 days before the campaign begins. The letter is addressed, "Dear Friend," asking for cooperation rather than confrontation. Gandhi proposes a diagnosis. British rule is a curse, he says, that has reduced us to serfdom, sapped the foundations of our culture, degrading us spiritually. The remedy, Gandhi says, well, ideally, is for the British to get out, to leave India to independence. But since that is not likely to happen, he proposed a civil disobedience against the salt tax. The letter is a perfect example of Gandhi's acting in the role of a physician of the body politic, offering first a diagnosis and then a remedy or a prescription. He condemns British imperialism not only because it's ruined the Indian economy by exploiting its natural resources for over a century and extracting revenue such as the iniquitous tax on salt, but it's also, he said, through its domination and humiliation of India, derided Indian culture and religion. It's violated the spirit of the country. Gandhi's remedy depends on whether or not Lord Irwin will try to make amends, for example, by abolishing the salt tax, but of course, more than that, giving India its independence. If such negotiation is refused, then the only recourse, Gandhi said, is to mobilize the country in a nonviolent campaign against the Raj. Gandhi wrote to Nehru on the eve of the march. It's nearing 10 p.m. and the air is thick with rumor that I shall be arrested during the night. Things are developing extraordinarily well. You can see Gandhi's own writing, fairly inscrutable, on the right column. Things, he said, are developing extraordinarily well. Volunteers are pouring in. One of the most inspiring moments of the Salt March came during the 24 hours before it began. After Gandhi had made his announcement, people from all over India came to join him. I've interviewed many of those who volunteered. They were among the thousands who surrounded his ashram on that eve of the march, men and women, students, Indians of all faiths, insisting that they were there to protect him because they knew his love for them, and they wanted somehow to return it, to keep him safe from arrest. When the British saw this force in numbers, they hesitated, and so gave the movement a chance to grow. This is an historic photograph. Gandhi, age 60, beginning the Salt March on March 12, 1930. It's a photo that has been reproduced in practically every biography of Gandhi and conveys the power of nonviolence better than any other. When my family and I followed in Gandhi's footsteps in 1975, the 45th anniversary of the march, we realized that Gandhi set a fast pace in order to cover 10 miles every day. He would pause for a rest when the sun, even in March, became too hot, giving speeches in the villages he marched through, using it as a recruitment vehicle. The march is brilliantly captured by Richard Attenborough in his film on Gandhi. Gandhi, as a political strategist, mobilized the march well. He politicized groups not included earlier. Millions of poor peasants, thousands of women, students from all regions. He engaged the media, the worldwide press, and film producers, who combined with local newspapers to cover the march. He dramatized the issue as a nonviolent struggle of right against might to seize the moral high ground. The Salt March shows then Gandhi as a superb political strategist, a remarkable then tactician. The most dramatic moment in modern Indian history must be when the Salt March ended in April 1930 at the sea. Gandhi picked up natural salt, a symbolic yet illegal act that inspired a nation to civil disobedience. Newsreels were spinning, and this action probably reached more movie screens than any event ever shown from India. Now he had broken the law, yet the British still refrained for another month from arresting him. Finally, they arrested him in May of 1930. What were the reasons for the success? Well, of course, numbers count. In any nonviolent movement, it helps if resistors greatly outnumber the adversary. The British in India never had more than 100,000 army and administrators, therefore outnumbered almost 4,000 to 1. The motives of the ruling authority matter too. As we've seen, the British rulers were ambivalent in their response, and this let the movement build. One of the aspects, an understated aspect, underrated, of Gandhi's gifts as a strategist and as a human being was his style of wit, his self-deprecating humor. He said at one point, "I possess few clothes and fewer teeth." In a well-known remark, asked by a British reporter, "What do you think of Western civilization?" he said it would be a good idea. Or mockery. On meeting George V in London, 1931, in his dhoti, a reporter asked if he were not embarrassed before the king, and Gandhi replied, "No, the king had on enough clothes for both of us." One of the last notes that Gandhi signed and left behind in 1948 as a final testament of his deepest belief was this: "I will give you a talisman. Whenever you are in doubt or when the self becomes too much with you, apply the following test. Recall the face of the poorest and the weakest man whom you may have seen, and ask yourself if the step you contemplate is going to be of any use to him. Will he gain anything by it? Will it restore him to a control over his own life and destiny? In other words, will it lead to Swaraj for the hungry and spiritually starving millions? If you do this, then you will find your doubts and yourself melting away," penned very shortly before his assassination in January of 1948. Whatever judgment history makes of Gandhi's achievement, it's undeniable that he saw his role as giving a voice to the poor of India, to the less privileged in need of sustenance and opportunity. When he wrote these words, he was merely reiterating the mission that he had proclaimed for most of his life, ever since he abandoned a life of affluence to identify with those in poverty, to champion their cause in the name of freedom and equality. Thank you. Now for the questions.
Thank you so much, Dennis. So now at this point, just a quick reminder, if you'd like to ask a question or provide a comment, you can either do so with a telephone or a microphone plugged into your computer by clicking on the raise hand button in your toolbar, or if you don't have a microphone or would prefer just to type in your question, you can do so in the questions panel on the right side of your toolbar, and then I'll read out the question for you. So it looks like we have a question right now. It's from James. Please go ahead, James. James, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much. I got a great deal out of this. My question is about nonviolent action. I understand groups like Gene Sharp's great work and your own organization's work are invaluable to forwarding nonviolence. However, my question is the idea of going into another country to help nonviolent activists by educating them has been going on for quite some time with many different nonviolent organizations. My question, however, is why does there seem to be the idea that nonviolent activists shouldn't financially help other nonviolent actions in other countries, nor even participate in their nonviolent actions, for fear that Americans will be going into other countries to promote actions in Egypt or Tunisia now, or Syria, in these countries? Why is it that nonviolent activists aren't allowed to do that by promoting Gandhi's ideas?
Well, I think, James, thank you for the question. It depends on the attitude of the nonviolent activists. That is, in the case of, for example, Reginald Reynolds. Reginald Reynolds was remarkable as an English pacifist Quaker, as you saw his picture, in terms of establishing rapport with Gandhi and unquestionably being on Gandhi's side against the British Imperial Raj. Reynolds was not the only Quaker to have poured into India. I've interviewed many of them, and there was a veritable army of Quakers sending money and going themselves. Not only Quakers, though. There were other good souls who participated actively. Journalists gave him immense support in publicizing the March and Satyagraha, that is Louis Fisher. So they should be encouraged, these people. Now, the problem we have today, of course, is that America is perceived as an imperialist power inspired by the CIA. And so, therefore, when I've gone to India to research Gandhi, I was sometimes suspect as being a CIA agent by the Indians. And so we have a different situation. But we must take Gandhi's model, and that is to invite people who are well-intended to contribute to the cause of nonviolent, of course, always nonviolent resistance.
Okay, our next question comes from Philip. Are you there, Philip? All right, we'll try one from someone who's typed one in. This question is from Awab, and Awab asks, how do you think Gandhi's philosophy can work for civilians in Pakistan who are continuously being attacked by drones and nonviolence doesn't seem to stop them?
Well, I'm in touch with a civilian in Pakistan, a very dear friend and former student of mine, Fatima Bhutto, who is constantly writing to me and in the press in the United States and other. Awab, you may know of her. She is a remarkable person in terms of her intelligence and writing ability. So I would take her wisdom. I agree entirely with what she has to say as a Pakistani journalist and just a highly admirable person with immense courage. And Fatima Bhutto urges that this drone attack, the successive, appalling, abysmal series of drone attacks that have been escalated under President Obama, that they must stop. And of course, any nonviolent advocate would do precisely this. And I think that there is room in Pakistan to reinforce this point of view. So if you want my response to this, then read the writings of Fatima Bhutto.
We have another write-in question from Arfas. And Arfas says, thank you very much for the presentation. In the beginning, you mentioned that Gandhi wanted to take on the English identity as time passed. As time passed, he began embracing his own culture and used that to strengthen his movement. In your opinion, do you feel there should be a balance between the two, or what would be a good model?
There is and was a balance between the two, and thank you for this question, and I should have emphasized it. While Gandhi was condemning Western civilization, he was also following the works and writings religiously of Leo Tolstoy. He, as I said, was influenced tremendously by Henry David Thoreau. His whole idea of civil disobedience was confirmed by Thoreau. And then there were other people like John Ruskin, author of Unto This Last, who inspired him. So all these Westerners, including, of course, the Sermon on the Mount, which Gandhi repeatedly referred to, all these Western sources were extremely important for Gandhi. So there should be a balance. It depends upon which Western sources, from a point of view of a Gandhian nonviolent advocate, which Western sources we tend to follow. From my point of view, I hope I've made it clear in my works as well as now, I'm all for Thoreau and the way in which he critiqued American democracy very forcefully. He's part of my balance. I advocate much of what Gandhi has to say, but I build into that the works of, as Gandhi did, of Tolstoy and Thoreau, but many of the American transcendentalists like Emerson and Alcott, and contemporary sources as well. There, I should have emphasized, certainly the influence of Martin Luther King Jr. on me has been immense, and I would strongly advocate his writings as a trustworthy source of Gandhian wisdom.
Our next question is from Eric, and Eric mentions that he recently read the book War Without Violence, which spoke about Gandhi's last testament and will, asking the leaders of the movement to not participate or become a part of the tainted government that was being formed, and instead continue by carrying out his constructive program. And he was wondering if you knew anything about this document.
Yes, War Without Violence, if it's the same one that I have written about and referred to in my works, that's an excellent source. It was written in the 30s by one of Gandhi's followers. If we're thinking of the same one, I hope we are, Eric. And in that book, it's rightly advocated that Gandhian nonviolence be applied throughout the world. He doesn't see any restrictions to it. He thinks, as a participant in Gandhi's Salt March itself, that it is an unbounded source of inspiration. And I agree entirely with the ideas set forth in that book, even though that they were set forth early in the late 30s. He's a very effective lecturer, too, the author of the book, War Without Violence.
All right, looks like we have another question from James. James, please go ahead one more time.
Yes, 2 years ago I sold 5 of Gandhi's personal belongings in New York City for about $2 million. It sort of created an international outcry, and I went back to India to apologize over it. I've donated half the money, but I still have the second half to donate, and I'm interested in trying to figure out where the best place to donate the money would be. Rather than funding nonviolent education, which I think is pivotal, I'm more interested in funding sort of people's movements, the action part of Gandhi's, like Satyagraha. Where do you think the best place for that would be?
Well, there are a number of sources, aren't there? And thank you, James. It's a remarkable story that you have. I heard about it, but I've certainly not spoken to the person that did it. That's fascinating. I'm a member and have been a member since 1968 of the War Resisters League, and that has been for me the main fountainhead of my inspiration in participating in the civil disobedience actions of the War Resisters League in New York City, and of course the International War Resisters League. Then by coincidence, I have encountered again an old friend of mine recently, and he is looking for funding. His name is Glenn Page, P-A-I-G-E, and he has he's written a book called Non-Killing Global Political Science, and that book was published in 2009. He founded in Honolulu the Center for Global Non-Killing, and I can give you more information on that, but it's an organization I think that's worth looking into. The email address is info@nonkilling.org. Glenn Page has long been an advocate of Gandhian nonviolence, but now he has shifted slightly his focus to non-killing, that is just to stop then the killing that goes on. And finally, of course, there's Gene Sharp that we mentioned before, and his Albert Einstein Institute. Gene Sharp cannot be praised too highly for what he has done. And you know his book, I'm sure, From Dictatorship to Democracy, on the institute that he's founded in Cambridge, Boston, the Albert Einstein Institute, to promote causes. I'm not sure, James, if this is exactly what you're looking for, but these are organizations that I trust and I advocate.
All right, our next question comes from Angela, who says, here in Israel and Palestine, the conditions are always ripe for an outbreak of more violence in answer to the Israeli occupation's harsh policies. In the absence of a Palestinian Gandhi, such as Mubarak Awad, who was deported in the 80s for preaching about nonviolence and Gandhi's heritage, is there a single principle from Gandhi's teachings that you wish people there would espouse more and that would be easily communicated to them?
Very good question. I think that the single principle that needs to be espoused is to keep trying active, nonviolent civil disobedience against the Israeli government on the part of the Palestinians. Now, you're right. Mubarak Awad tried that, and it was not successful. My friend Arun Gandhi Gandhi's grandson made some unpopular comments, and he was expelled from the country. So we have a problem in terms of dealing with this, and we know in a heartbreaking sense how many people have, like Rachel Corrie, have tried desperately to make a difference. And so if we take Rachel Corrie as an example, we, I think, don't want to advocate action that is going to be, very unfortunately, self-destructive. We want an organized movement, and that kind of movement has been advocated by many people. I haven't mentioned before the movement that I have supported since it has formed after the invasion of Iraq, and that's Code Pink. Code Pink is a Gandhian nonviolent resistance movement in the United States and has undertaken specifically actions in Palestine, and so, and particularly in Gaza. These are organizations that can be supported. As single individuals, the most we can do, I think, is to follow and support the organizations that, after research, we trust.
All right, our next question is from Bhakta, and Bhakta says, in Nepal, large and powerful political parties are not listening to the voices of marginalized and small political parties and communities. Nonviolence is the best tool, but small communities aren't able to get what they need, such as human rights, livelihood, and political and financial rights. So considering this situation, how do you think that smaller groups can make their voice heard using nonviolence?
Well, in Nepal, there is an opportunity to make a difference if only the people can be marshaled, organized along the lines of, say, the first Prime Minister, you recall, B.P. Koirala, who set the tone and the message, I believe, for his work. I happened to be in Nepal when B.P. Koirala was Prime Minister and then arrested, and that was a tragedy. B.P. Koirala's tradition in Nepal needs to be revived. There is that inspiration there, and the tradition was one of, he was himself an advocate of Gandhian methods of nonviolence. It needs to be directed now against the Maoists, against forces of violence in Nepal, and organized to address some of the many problems that poverty-stricken country now has. It will certainly not be an easy task. Nepal is an excellent example, though. On the border of India, an excellent example of where a difference can be made. And organizations there, I think, need to be supported that are dedicated to nonviolence.
All right, and actually I was hoping to ask a question really quickly, dealing with the relevance of Gandhi today. To what extent do you think that Gandhi has played a role model for recent events and protests in the Middle East, whether philosophically or strategically? And what do you think his role might be in the future of nonviolence?
Excellent question, Jake. Coming from you, I would expect that it would be. I think that he has played a decisive role through Gene Sharp especially, not only in the Middle East, but in Serbia, in the Otpor student organization resisting Milosevic, as I might have mentioned, and then in both Tunisia and in Egypt. In those countries, Gene Sharp's words, as we understand, have been taken very well, and Gene Sharp was an early writer on Gandhi. His first book, Gandhi Wields the Weapon of Moral Power, was extraordinarily influential, and then, of course, his subsequent works on the politics of nonviolent action. This is a manual, along with this shorter treatise that he's published, From Dictatorship to Democracy, on how to resist through Gandhian methods. This has worked in Tunisia and in Egypt because the authority there was overcome by dedicated marchers or advocates, participants in nonviolent action. Whenever we look at these situations, Egypt, for example, Tunisia, we can only hope that nonviolent action will prevail rather than violent. I remember as I watched the events from December through February in Tunisia and in Egypt, and I knew that the whole world was hoping that it would not be spoiled by turning from a nonviolent to a violent action. So far, that hope has been fulfilled, and it confirms then the sympathy, the deep sympathy that most people have for nonviolence rather than the kind of violence that we're seeing, for example, in Libya.
Thanks, Dennis. And just taking a look at the clock, it looks like we're just about out of time. So I was wondering, are there any final closing remarks that you'd like to make before we wrap up the presentation?
Yes. The closing remark that I would make would be from Martin Luther King. I was going to read this quote because it's so profound and pertinent. It shows how nonviolence can work in a completely different context. He wrote in 1958 about Gandhi's profound influence on the American civil rights struggle, quote, "If humanity is to progress, Gandhi is inescapable. He lived, thought, and acted inspired by the vision of humanity evolving toward a world of peace and harmony. We may ignore him at our risk. He is the only morally and practically sound method. His is the only morally and practically sound method open to oppressed people in their struggle for freedom." That message given by Martin Luther King, the American that I respect, revere most, and was associated with, that message, I think, applies as much then in 1958 when he wrote it as it does, as it continues to do today. It is a message then of hope that King showed us a way: civil disobedience, nonviolence, a hope for this country and world to be transformed, and we certainly need to fulfill that aspiration.
Great. Thank you so much, Dennis. And I see we still have some questions left. Unfortunately, we won't have time to get to them. But any questions that people have typed in, I will forward to Dennis, so you'll be able to see those. And as a reminder, this webinar has been recorded, and it's going to be uploaded to our website in the next couple of days. So feel free to go to nonviolent-conflict.org once it's posted. And we'll also post the slideshow presentation from Dennis, along with any other resources you may want to recommend on our website.
Yes, thank you.
And if you have any other questions or you wanted to follow up with Dennis about anything, feel free to email webinar@nonviolent-conflict.org, and we'll be sure to forward those to Dennis. So we'll be sure to keep you all up to date with our next webinar, which will be coming very soon. And with that, thank you so much, Dennis, for your presentation. We really appreciate it.
Jake, I'm grateful to you, the organization, and to all of those who have listened in for your responses, and I hope your continuing responses. I will be eager to receive any further communications. Goodbye, and thank you. Namaste.
Thank you, and have a great afternoon, everyone.